newspaper, of course, it should cover the important news, the crime news, the important things that cities and county governments do, and fires. But that in addition to that, it ought to tell things that happen in the community that are of interest to people. All newspapers try to do that. Every newspaper has features as well as what you call hard news. But I think we may try a little harder to find things that are going to be of interest to people, even though they may not be of great significance.
Snakes in the Attic Suit Them Just Fine by Anthony Campbell. Poisonous or not, most folks just don't like snakes, period. Nick and Nancy Macaris and her family don't feel that way. Wild snakes are frequent visitors to their home on Spring Creek Drive. The Macarises have found that life is a lot more interesting with the serpents around. The Macaris family moved to Guntersville 2 years ago from Chicago. Shortly after moving into their home, they heard something rustling around in their attic. Mr. Macaris went up to investigate and came back down with a half-dozen shed snake skins, some more than 6 feet long.
Hey, Nance?
Yeah.
Look what I found in the attic.
Let's see. Oh, wow.
Since then, the family has seen several different varieties of snakes around their home. They still hear snakes rustling around in the attic from time to time. Their take is that the snakes aren't bothering them, so they don't bother the snakes. The snakes that get in the attic are apparently tree snakes, known for their climbing ability. Mrs. Macaris took a picture of a tree snake climbing the door of their shed. I was just about to reach for the knob to open the door when I looked down and saw the snake, Mr. Macaris said. I'm glad I looked first. He admits to being a little more squeamish about snakes than his wife. They've also watched tree snakes climb the bricks on their home. I've never seen anything like it, Mrs. Macaris said. Mrs. Macaris is a big fan of the snakes. They're good for the environment, she said. They keep down populations of rats and mice. They're one of the first things affected by pollution, so their presence is an indicator of a healthy environment. The home backs up to the foot of Sand Mountain, and there's a large expanse of rocky woods behind it. The snakes apparently come down from the mountain. The Macaris family gets a kick out of all kinds of wildlife. Other critters they've seen near their home include foxes, turkeys, and deer.
There had been Guntersville newspaper since going back to 1880, but the present, you might call the present newspaper, began in 1941 when my father came here from Birmingham. He was working on the Birmingham Post, and he decided he wanted to start a paper of his own. So he came here, came into town on a bus, didn't have a car, rented a second floor office, one-room office, just about half a block from where we're located now, and started putting out a newspaper.
An adult skin weighs approximately 6 pounds.
My father had an awfully good ear for knowing what was going to interest people. He would say to me sometimes, he would have observed something or heard something, and he'd say, "You think we ought to get something on that?" And it might not have occurred to me, but he meant, "Do you think might that be a story for the paper?" And it nearly always was.
A stroll along Wyeth Drive. Lisa Young and her daughter Sydney, 4, were startled the other day to see an emu 5 or 6 feet tall strolling calmly in front of their home on Wyeth Drive. The bird appeared very calm in spite of the barking by what sounded like all the dogs in the neighborhood. Mrs. Young, the wife of Dr. Craig Young, turned away briefly to call animal control, and when she looked back, the emu was gone. She thought first it might have been an ostrich, but David Rodruck, the lawyer, said it was definitely an emu. He raises emus at Alder Springs.
Things that most people thought would be trivial, or he could see angles in them that would be intriguing to people, and he wrote about a lot of things that were. I think someone once pointed out he wrote a story about a column of ants and where it was going as it went across in the parking lot of the bank across the street, and he followed it and where it went. But he made that into a darn interesting story. Most newspapers would have kind of snickered at that.
That strolling emu finds a new home. The emu that Lisa Young saw strolling along Wyeth Drive in front of her home is now living near Scant City. Mike Henderson, a city employee who works part-time on animal control, heard about the emu and decided to adopt it. It's now at his home on Brindley Mountain, sharing space with a pig. Mr. Pinnell said this was the second emu he's caught, the first on Mountain Laurel Lane near Alder Springs. That was a few years ago when the emu business was a bigger thing than it is now. A good many people who started raising them gave it up after the price of chicks and eggs dropped.
We do run a lot of animal stories. Some of our better pieces have had to do with animals. One advantage of an animal story is you can say almost anything about an animal and he won't complain. So.
Mother love. Wayne Williams, the custodian at Sloman Primary School at Douglas, noticed this mother kildee sitting faithfully on her nest on the ground in back of the school. You have to look pretty close to see the bird, which depends on camouflage to survive. But when Mr. Williams looked closer when the mother was away, he discovered she has been sitting on a pecan. She has turned it and sat on it until it's slick. We feel so sorry for this bird, Principal Tracy Penny said. The mother has been sitting on the nest at least 2 weeks and was still there at last report. Kildee make their nest on the ground, arranging them out of gravel.
Well, I guess if people have seen the Wall Street Journal, we look a little that way. We don't have multi-column headlines. All our headlines are the same size. They're very small. And a good many years ago, nearly all newspapers looked that way. Over the years, other newspapers began using larger headlines and headlines that cover several columns. Part of that was so they could sell news. You have a big headline that sold newspapers when you put it in the rack. But for reasons, I don't know exactly why it was, they began making the papers look a little more dramatic, possibly. We just never saw much reason to change. We feel that if a headline is big enough to be seen at arm's length, which is the way most people read the newspaper, that's really, you don't need to be able to see what it looks like on the other side of the room.
$110,000 cash found in storekeeper's safe. After Howard Jackson died May 21st at the age of 90, some of his relatives had the safe in his store cut open to see if it contained a will. They didn't find a will, but they found something else, about $110,000 in cash. Nobody expected that, said Shannon Cahill, whose father was a first cousin of Mr. Jackson. The money has been put in a safety deposit box until there's a determination as to what to do with it. Mr. Jackson was a widower with no children. His closest relatives are thought to be about 10 first cousins. The law sets out a procedure for disposing of assets of people who die without wills, with priority assigned to people according to their degrees of kinship. The probate judge names an administrator of the estate who can be required to post a bond as a guarantee that things will be handled properly. That appointment can be made once 40 days has elapsed and no will has turned up. In the 1990s, Mr. Jackson got into the salvage grocery business in a pretty big way. Mr. Cahill lived with him for 3 years and remembers going with him every Friday to Mitchell Grocery, the wholesale place in Albertville. And he'd buy 50 or 60 damaged sacks of dog food to take back to his store. He said Mr. Jackson lived simply and didn't spend much, other than paying his light bill and phone bill. His home was close to the store. He told some people he had a will, and his relatives are still trying to find it, Mr. Cahill said.
The great horned owl is the only animal that will eat a skunk.
We don't separate our news that much. We'll have we don't put our weddings all in one section or our sports all in one section. I think if you do that, the people who are interested in sports may not read anything else, and the people who are interested in weddings and social events may not read anything else. We'd like to have people read every page in the paper. I think it's good makes our advertisement more valuable, for example.
Bumper pecan crop has them cracking like crazy. There are pecans all over the place at the feed supply and western store on Blunt Avenue. They're in buckets, paper bags, shopping bags, garbage bags, boxes, tubs, and pillowcases. We've got 3 machines going and have cracked more pecans so far than all last year and will continue to crack until February, said manager Kevin Reeves. It's clearly a bumper crop. There's a 2-day waiting period for orders, Mr. Reeves said. The pecans started coming in late September but really got going after Thanksgiving, said employee Jackie Gandy. We're getting all kinds of phone calls asking about the service. The store is the only place in this area that cracks nuts. But it looks as if it's a one-of-a-kind in a wider area, too. We've had nuts brought in from Bessemer, Knoxville, and Atlanta, said Mr. Reeves. A lady from Knoxville said there wasn't anyone cracking nuts up her way. Last year, the store ran 2 cracking machines and did fine with the volume. This year, they're using 3 machines and have them going continuously. They can crack 4 pounds of pecans a minute, Mr. Reeves said. People are also calling about the bunch of shell pieces that have been left over. They're used for mulch. We're a nutty business, cracking up all day, quipped Mrs. Gandy. We've heard way too many nutty jokes, responded Mr. Reeves.
The world's termites outweigh the world's humans 10 to 1.
Well, of course, there's crime stories. We're no different from other towns. We have more crime, or in other counties, we have more crime than you think there would, than you'd like to have. I mean, we had a murder this week. We had the story you mentioned a minute ago of the several of our county officials were accused of it was called ethics violation, but what it meant was taking bribes or taking money, and those things are. That went on and on for over a year.
Applebee's restaurant reported that a young man ate $10.36 lunch, lime chicken and a Mr. Pibb, and walked out without paying.
If someone reports a crime to police, and that will become what they call an incident report on the files of the police or the sheriff's office. If it's in our territory, in general, we use almost all of those.
Underground kerosene tank zapped by lightning. You can't predict what lightning will do. Just ask Scott Johnson, owner of the Country Cooler. Firemen got a call at 7:13 Sunday morning, right after a bolt of lightning rocked the neighborhood. A man driving past reported smoke coming out of the ground in front of the store and station at Pleasant Grove Road and Highway 205. The store was closed because it was Sunday morning, but the lightning had left quite a mark. A 12-inch cast iron cover was missing from the top of a 4,000-gallon tank of kerosene underneath the concrete apron. The firemen couldn't locate the 12-inch cover anywhere. It didn't turn up till Scott found it on the other side of the store, on the concrete floor of a covered area out back. It had gone over the building and come down through the roof, he said. There's no telling how high it had to go to come down that hard. He's thankful it didn't land on the roof over the interior of the building and crash through the ceiling and into the merchandise or fixtures. He's thankful the lightning didn't knock the kerosene. Most of all, he's thankful it didn't hit one of the 3 gasoline tanks next to the kerosene tank, each one holding 6,000 gallons of a fuel much more volatile than kerosene. If it had hit the gas tanks, this whole place would probably just be one big hole in the ground, he said. But like we said, you can't predict what lightning will do. The store never even lost power.
Photos by Leon. More than 100 portraits and other photographs by the late Leon Kennemer are on display through December 31st at Guntersville Museum, and visitors can look through hundreds more that aren't on the walls. Most of the photos were in Leon's studio, which has now been cleared out. People who find pictures of themselves can keep them, Mr. Kennemer's wife Betty said. Many of Mr. Kennemer's awards are also in the exhibit. He was known in the photographic circles around the world, and a number of the pictures on display were taken in other countries.
After I got out of college, I worked 4 years on the Daily in Columbus, Ohio, and then 9 years after that on the Daily in Louisville, Kentucky. And then I came back here and worked with my father until he died in 1995.
As the patient came slowly out of the anesthetic, he said, "Why are all the blinds drawn, doctor?" "Well, there's a fire across the street, and we didn't want you to think that the operation was a failure."
Well, the newsroom looks different, of course, but what you do is not, I was surprised, it's not that much different. In each case, you're going out and talking to people or looking at records or listening to testimony or meeting, things that said at meetings, coming back and writing them. It's not as much difference as I thought it would be. Of course, I had some idea of what it was like to be on a small paper because I'd kind of grown up on this one. I worked on it after school and in summers when I was young. But working as a full-time working reporter is not as much different. Some people think that if you want to really succeed in journalism, you really have to work for a large paper. And there's probably something to be said that that you'll get better supervision and better guidance and better training on a large paper than you will on most small ones. But what you do is, it's not much different. You're still getting information and telling it in a way that people are going to want to read it.
8-foot rooster finds a home at Warrenton. An 8-foot-tall, 200-pound rooster is turning heads at Ellis King Jr.'s place on the Warrenton Road, just across from the rock crusher. Mr. King and his wife and his in-laws, Dan and Katie Stocka of Guntersville, were on a trip in Mississippi when they saw the fiberglass rooster for sale at a place that makes them. Since I'm in the chicken business, they all thought that I needed that rooster at this place, Mr. King said. They ended up buying the rooster, going back later to get it in a pickup truck. Mr. King lives on a farm that has been his family for 80 years or more. He's been chicken farming for the last 7 years. His son Buck actually runs the farm, he said. The giant rooster is a good piece off the road, but it's very visible to passing motorists. It's next to Mr. King's driveway. It's on a 10-foot pole. It's only been up about a week, Mr. King said, but I've already had several people mention it to me. They really got a lot of looks driving down the highway with the rooster in the back of his Chevrolet pickup on the way home from Mississippi. People were taking pictures of us as we went down the road, he said. They strapped the rooster down tight and didn't have any trouble getting him home. They've had it a couple of months, but have just lately got it put up.
Our other two reporters type on Macintoshes, and I used to use a manual typewriter. I'm a little more comfortable with a typewriter. I'm also a little more comfortable editing copy if it's on paper than if it's on a computer screen. But and of course we have computers in our bookkeeping and in our circulation. Nearly every desk up front's got a computer on it except mine. My son John, who handles our advertising, they use computers, and we build ads on computers. We use word processors. We're computerized all around.
A farmer and his wife went to the fair. The farmer was fascinated by the airplane rides, but balked at the $10 tickets. "Let's make a deal," said the pilot. "If you and your wife can ride without making a single sound, I won't charge you anything. Otherwise, you pay the $10. "Good deal," the farmer said. So they went for the ride. When they got back, the pilot said, "If I hadn't been there, I'd have never believed it. You never made a sound." "It wasn't easy either," said the farmer. "I almost yelled when my wife fell out."
This goes back to my father also. He had the feeling that almost everybody most people have an interesting story to tell, and that it's our job when we tell about someone's death to tell as much as we can about that person's life, and not just the bare information that every newspaper gets from funeral homes, who survived and when the arrangements are going to be. So we contact, whenever we can, we contact the families of the people who've died and try to get them to tell us something about that person. All newspapers will do this when prominent people die. And we feel that we ought to at least do what we can to tell about people who are maybe not prominent.
Glenn Waldrop, 83. He was one of the last mailmen to deliver mail in Parches Cove on a bicycle. He was nicknamed Jelly when he was a halfback on the Arab high school football team because he could slip through the hands of tacklers like jelly. A retired electrician at the Eau Revere aluminum plant in Scottsboro, Foy Glenn Waldrop of Wabbittown, died Tuesday, July 10, 2001 at Marshall North Hospital. He was 83. He had been a resident of the Marshall Manor nursing home for the past 2 years. His wife Lillian lived there with him. They had been married for 62 years and had lived at Wabbittown since 1948. Mr. Waldrop was the youngest and last surviving son of R.G. and Pearl Smith Waldrop and was born in Union Grove. He had 5 brothers and a sister who preceded him in death.
It's surprising. People are usually pretty willing to tell you about these things. Some families are sensitive and don't want anything in the paper, but most families are glad to talk about their people and are willing to tell you things that are of interest to them. And it's amazing how often you can find among people who may not have been educated or learned, but that did interesting things during their lives and were successful in their own way at things.
The average 7-inch lead pencil will draw a line 35 miles long.
The Master Gardener class from left: Kneeling, Donna Miller, Crossville; Judy Swords, Horton; Basil Frank, Arab. Corrections: Sarah Long of Horton wasn't really smoking a cigarette when the new Master Gardeners group had its picture taken. A mechanical glitch in the printing process just made it look that way.
No Other Road That Straight for That Long by Anthony Campbell. Take a glance at a county road map and you'll quickly notice that practically all of the roads have lots of snaky curves and turns. One road stands out because it's straight as an arrow over a long course. It's the Section Line Road, which runs from Highway 75 in Albertville to the brow of the mountain overlooking Big Spring Valley, some 8.5 miles in all. But while it's all straight, it's not all level. The road rolls gently up and down from one end to the other. You really can't appreciate the straightness of the road for all the hills. You might even think there were curves if you didn't know better. The road is fairly narrow too, only about 20 feet wide in most places. It narrows to one lane the farther you get from Albertville. We drove the road from Highway 75 in Albertville to where it dead ends at the top of the mountain at Charles Rice's Chicken and Cattle Farm. The paving on the Section Line Road is in pretty good shape throughout, far better than what you typically find on a county road. It's a right pretty drive.
Judge, 30 years in prison. Prisoner, but Judge, I won't live that long. Judge, don't worry, do what you can.
If you can imagine, all the space in a newspaper, and every one of those columns has got to come down right to the end. You can't leave a hole in there. So years ago, all newspapers had little fillers. And they would be, some of them fillers of some historical nature. Daddy came up with the idea, as far as I know he invented it, of using jokes. It's awfully hard, though, to find a joke that's short and clean and funny. And we use them. There are not as many jokes as we have space for. So over time, people will see the same joke appear in that paper again. And sometimes my wife gets on me for saying, you've used that joke too recently.
A Way of Building Before Concrete Blocks by Angela Otts. A good many homes and buildings that were built around the 1920s and 1930s aptly fit the definition of being rock solid. They're built of rocks gathered from fields and ridges with walls as thick as 12 inches. Some buildings have the rocks as part of their porches or foundations. Others are completely covered with them. Some good examples are the whole back stage or the Old Rock School, Claysville School, the Rock House Flowers and Gifts on Gunter Avenue, McLaughlin and Marshall Law Offices on Blunt, the original DAR School, and the New Life Methodist Church at Grant. It seems all of these were built in the 1920s or 30s, and the rocks were collected the same way. Fieldstones, as they were called, were flat and rough. They were cut into smaller pieces with a mallet and shaped to be somewhat uniform. These were quite evident in the Old Rock School and Claysville School. When the Claysville School construction started in August 1928, people in the community worked together to pick up the rock out in fields and pastures, according to some old records Junior Cornelius has about Claysville. A prominent example, the original DAR School at Grant, was built in 1924 as a 4-room unit of rock sealed in cement. School officials wanted Gus Allred to build the school, but he was busy putting up the old city school, now the whole backstage on Rayburn Avenue. They got F.H. Copeland and his brother Ira from St. Clair County to do the work. To keep the cost of construction reasonable, the people of Grant gathered the rocks by hand, in aprons and wagons and in every possible fashion, and placed them at the site. Grant historian June Troop said the type of masonry on the school soon dropped out of favor, probably because there weren't too many men who knew how to do it and newer construction practices were introduced. It's kind of an art that has disappeared, she said.
I think the important thing is not the way paper looks, but what's in it. And I think our readers have learned that if they read this paper, they're going to find things that are interesting to read.
Big Pecan shatters glass. A freak incident at Ray Sanchez's home on Nixon Chapel Road led to the back window of his 1993 Toyota Corolla being shattered. He said he parked underneath a pecan tree in his yard and an unusually large pecan fell out of the tree, hit the back window, and shattered it. Deputies and Mr. Sanchez surmised that the high heat and size of the pecan combined to cause the damage.